Somewhere in a forgotten attic, a dusty box sat sealed for over 80 years. Inside, dozens of never-before-seen photographs taken by German soldiers during the early days of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. These images aren't propaganda. They're raw, haunting, and brutally honest. Captured by the men themselves as they marched through Belarus and into the heart of the Soviet Union, these photos reveal a version of World War II rarely shown in textbooks. From scorched villages to quiet moments in war-torn fields, this is what the invasion really looked like, through the eyes of those who fought. And for the first time in decades, we're finally seeing the truth. Somewhere in an attic, inside a dusty, unmarked box, lay a roll of undeveloped film that hadn't seen daylight since the summer of 1941. No one had touched it in over 80 years. But when historians recently uncovered these photos, what they found shocked even the most seasoned experts. These weren't official propaganda pictures or military-posed portraits. They were personal, raw, and brutally honest glimpses into World War II, captured by the very German soldiers who lived it. The story begins with a private photo album, hidden away by a soldier from the Wehrmacht's 7th Panzer Division. Passed down quietly through family generations, no one realized the historical significance until a great-grandson donated it to a small museum in rural Germany. When archivists began scanning the negatives, they were stunned. The images revealed forgotten scenes of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. These were not the usual dramatic shots of tanks rolling in triumph or perfectly organized columns. Instead, they showed war's quiet in-between moments, soldiers resting in the grass, destroyed towns stripped of life, and faces, young, tired, sometimes smiling, caught in fleeting moments of calm before the storm. Unlike battlefield reports or staged newsreels, these photos hadn't been filtered through Nazi censors. They showed what the soldiers really saw: ordinary villages on fire, locals staring in fear, graves dug hurriedly by the roadside. Some images even had handwritten notes on the back, names, dates, places that had long been swallowed by history. In a world flooded with digital reconstructions and dramatized documentaries, this was something rare. Untouched truth. Why were these photos hidden for so long? Likely because of their content. Some showed German soldiers attending funerals, others captured the destruction of civilian homes, and one haunting shot showed an abandoned frying pan still hanging on a stove, the only remnant of a family who had fled or been killed. These weren't the kinds of images meant for public morale. They were never supposed to be seen. Until now. And what they show is chilling. In June 1941, with Europe already under his heel, Adolf Hitler unleashed the largest military invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border, backed by more than 3,000 tanks and thousands of aircraft. The Wehrmacht swept across Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics with terrifying speed. Hitler believed that Stalin's Red Army would collapse like a house of cards within 6 weeks. At first, it seemed he was right. These newly uncovered photos capture that moment. The overconfidence, the energy, the belief in swift conquest. Tanks rolled down dirt roads. Villages were occupied with barely a shot fired. Soviet defenses crumbled in some regions. One photo shows a column of German flamethrower tanks, the Panzer II Flamingo, rumbling down a Belarusian road toward the front. In another, a German soldier crouches beside a roadside, binoculars in hand, peering into the vast Soviet landscape with a look of calm, maybe even excitement. But what's not visible in the early images is the storm gathering just beyond the trees. What these soldiers didn't know was that they weren't just invading a country. They were stepping into a war unlike anything they'd seen before. The Soviet Union was not Poland. It was not France. It was vast, rugged, and unrelenting. Soviet soldiers may have been under-equipped, but they were not unwilling. They fought bitterly, retreating only to regroup and strike back harder. Stalin issued scorched earth orders. Nothing was to be left behind. Entire towns were burned. Bridges were blown up to slow the German advance. Fields were poisoned. Wells collapsed. Railroads torn apart. Still, in these early weeks, the Germans pushed forward. They moved an average of 15 to 30 kilometers per day. The photos show soldiers riding horses, pushing bicycles, and marching on foot, not quite the motorized juggernaut we imagine. In fact, nearly 90% of the German army was made up of regular infantry units, not flashy panzer divisions. Supplies were carried by horse-drawn wagons, just like in the First World War. It's here that the illusion of modern, mechanized blitzkrieg begins to unravel. The invasion was powerful, yes, but it was also slow, muddy, and human. And as they advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the bodies began to pile up. What makes these photographs so unsettling is not what they show, but what they don't. There's no glory, no grand victory, no orchestrated triumph. Instead, we see young soldiers huddled in makeshift tents. Some are shirtless, washing their faces in tin basins. Others read German military newsletters like Der Panzerfaust, or sit quietly writing letters home. These aren't scenes of battle. They're fragments of daily survival. One particularly haunting image shows a German soldier asleep in the shade, helmet by his side, while another scans the horizon with rabbit ear binoculars. In another, two men peel potatoes beside a mountain of field gear. There's an odd quiet in these photos, the sense of a pause before something terrible. Even in occupied Belarusian villages, life seems strangely still. Local women thresh wheat, while German soldiers walk by with rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. Some villagers look on with blank expressions. Others seem to ignore the soldiers altogether, as if nothing can be done now. It's not all silent, though. There are strange, surreal moments caught on camera. In one, a stuffed bear, likely stolen from a museum, is tied to a lamppost in a town square. In another, a soldier stands in front of a statue of Vladimir Lenin, grinning as if on vacation. There's even a photo of a German military orchestra performing for troops in a makeshift field concert. The contrast between music and massacre couldn't be sharper, but not all the images are light. One photo shows a simple birch cross marked with a soldier's name, helmet resting on top. It's a battlefield grave, rushed, unadorned, temporary. Another shows a scorched village with only stone stoves standing, a sight so common it became symbolic of the Eastern Front. The most gut-wrenching photo of all might be the one showing a frying pan hanging on a stove in the ruins of a house. The family that once used it? Gone. Dead. Or fled. These were the quiet casualties. Civilians caught in the flood of tanks and artillery. German soldiers may have seen themselves as warriors or even liberators. But through their own cameras, they revealed a different story. One of villages burned, lives uprooted, and a war machine far more fragile than it seemed. There's one photo in the album that haunts you long after you've looked away. It shows a small Belarusian village, or what's left of it. The buildings are scorched black, the windows shattered, the trees are stripped bare, and in the center of the frame, 3 stone chimneys remain upright. the only things left standing. This wasn't a battlefield. This was someone's home. The village was called November, and like countless others caught in the path of Germany's eastern invasion, it was obliterated during the summer of 1941. According to Soviet records and oral accounts, November had fewer than 200 residents when the Germans arrived. Most were elderly men, women, and children. The younger men had been conscripted just days before, pulled into Stalin's chaotic, last-minute mobilization as the Wehrmacht swept closer. When the Germans reached Nov, they found no soldiers, no fortifications, just civilians. But November was burned anyway. The photos reveal the aftermath. One shows a group of German soldiers walking their horses down the village's main street, once lined with homes, now just piles of ash. In the background stands the shell of a church, its roof torn open. Interestingly, this church had already been shut down before the invasion. Soviet authorities had turned it into a garage, part of their campaign to eliminate religion. Now, both regimes had erased what little remained of the town's soul. We don't know who set the fire, but German field orders from that period were clear. If a village was suspected of harboring partisans, it was to be destroyed. No investigation, no trial. Burn it down. And yet, life clung on. One image captures a surreal town meeting in the ruins. A handful of German officers speak to the remaining villagers. Women stand in silence, clutching small sacks of grain. A few barefoot children peek from behind their mothers' skirts. These civilians now had to feed not only themselves, but also the foreign soldiers who had taken over their homes. You can see the weariness in their faces, and in the German soldiers too. This wasn't the easy victory they had been promised. The Blitzkrieg was slowing. The resistance was hardening, and the Eastern Front was just beginning to show its true face. History often paints the German war machine as this unstoppable, perfectly oiled engine of destruction. Tanks, half-tracks, motorized columns. But the reality captured in these photographs tells a different story. Germany's army, especially on the Eastern Front in 1941, was shockingly primitive. There's a photo of a German soldier peeling potatoes next to a wooden cart pulled by a horse. Another shows a group of infantrymen loading equipment onto bicycles. Not motorcycles, not trucks, but standard two-wheel bikes. Why? Because nearly 90% of Germany's divisions during Operation Barbarossa were not motorized. They relied on foot marches, wagons, and horse-drawn artillery just like in World War I. The images make it painfully clear. One shot shows a dusty column of men trudging along a narrow dirt road, their faces red with sweat, rifles slung over tired shoulders. Another captures a broken bridge, blown up by retreating Soviets, with German soldiers constructing a pontoon replacement. In the background, wrecked T-26 Soviet tanks lay smoldering in the weeds. Even when they advanced, the Germans had to build their own roads, replace bridges, and scavenge fuel from abandoned Soviet vehicles. This wasn't rapid conquest. It was a logistical nightmare. And the vehicles they did have? Many were prone to breakdowns in the heat and mud. There's a photo of a soldier bent over an open engine hatch, smoke curling from inside. The caption scribbled on the back reads, "She didn't make it." Another photo shows a Junkers Ju-88 bomber, parked crookedly beside a field road. Its tail has been shredded by flak. The crew isn't celebrating a successful raid. They're huddled nearby, quiet. This wasn't the glamorous war Hitler promised. It wasn't even efficient. Soldiers were being ground down not by enemy fire, but by exhaustion, weather, and faulty equipment. It's a reminder that behind every myth of German superiority, there was mud, blood, and broken wheels. In the middle of a clearing, surrounded by pine trees and silence, stands a row of wooden crosses. Each one has a name scrawled across the plank. Helmets rest atop the graves. One has flowers, freshly picked. Another has a cigarette tucked into a crack in the wood. These aren't military cemeteries. These are field graves, temporary, improvised, and heartbreaking. The Wehrmacht lost tens of thousands of men in the first few months of Operation Barbarossa. Despite their early success, the cost was staggering. The photographs show these losses in brutal clarity. One image captures a small burial ceremony. A group of soldiers standing in a loose circle, heads bowed, one man playing a slow tune on a harmonica. There's no chaplain, no flag, just a grave in the dirt and a moment of silence before marching on. Another photo, labeled Vitebsk, July 1941, shows a German gravesite just outside a destroyed town. Rows of makeshift crosses stretch toward the tree line. These men had no idea their final resting place would be forgotten, eventually overrun as the Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back in the years ahead. Many of these graves were never relocated. Their bones still lie beneath the soil, beneath Belarusian farmland, lost to time. What's eerie is that these photos weren't meant to be morbid. At the time, the soldiers taking them likely saw the graves as symbols of honor. Fallen comrades remembered, heroes who had given their lives for the fatherland. Some photos even show soldiers saluting the dead or scribbling notes into journals beside the burial mounds. But history adds context. These weren't just graves. They were markers of Germany's overconfidence, evidence that the easy invasion was already unraveling. Every cross told a story not just of death, but of delusion. The myth of invincibility was being buried, one soldier at a time. And the worst was yet to come. Not every image from this haunting collection shows fire and ruin. In fact, some of the most chilling are the ones where the war seems absent. In one photograph, German soldiers are lounging under a tree, shirts off, laughing over a can of soup. Another shows a group peeling potatoes with their rifles propped up behind them. One soldier has a cigarette tucked behind his ear and is reading a propaganda newsletter called Der Panzerfaust, the tank fist. They look like young men at summer camp, except they're deep inside enemy territory, and the next photo shows burned houses on the horizon. This bizarre contrast between the mundanity of life and the horror of death runs through the entire album. There's a picture of a soldier writing a letter to his mother. He's barefoot, wearing only underwear, resting on a wool blanket next to his machine gun. Another frame captures a field concert, with an impromptu orchestra playing for soldiers who sit cross-legged in the grass. One of them holds a camera instead of a rifle. These quiet moments feel surreal when you realize what surrounded them. In the very next image, the same troops are shown marching through scorched Belarusian villages. Women thresh wheat in the distance, while their children stare hollow-eyed at the camera. The Wehrmacht had taken their homes, and now the same soldiers were asking for bread and water. This illusion of normalcy was a vital tool for the German army. Daily routines, letters, music, and humor were coping mechanisms. They made the brutal invasion feel bearable. They gave the illusion that what they were doing was civilized, that it was part of some grand mission, not a mass invasion and occupation. But the quiet didn't last. The Soviet resistance was growing. Partisan activity was on the rise, and the soldiers who once lounged under trees would soon be sleeping in snow-covered trenches, with frost-bitten fingers wrapped around rusted weapons. By the winter of 1941, Many of the men in these photos would either be dead or dying. Their summer lullabies would be replaced by artillery blasts echoing through frozen forests. By late 1941, the cracks in the German war machine were no longer subtle. The lightning speed of the initial invasion, the Blitzkrieg, had sputtered. Soviet resistance wasn't breaking. It was hardening. The Wehrmacht was bleeding. The photos start to change. Earlier in the album, there are neat rows of panzer tanks, half-tracks, and supply convoys. Later, those scenes are replaced with wreckage, abandoned vehicles, burned-out trucks, horses scavenging in destroyed supply dumps. In one image, you see soldiers trying to dig a tank out of thick Belarusian mud. Their expressions are no longer confident. They're frustrated, exhausted. One man looks directly into the lens, his face caked in dirt. The illusion is breaking. The weather turned on them, too. Summer gave way to early frosts. The German army was not equipped for Russian winters. Thin boots, no antifreeze, limited fuel. In one image, soldiers are huddled around a fire, their breath visible in the morning air. Another shows a field kitchen frozen solid. But perhaps the most damning photo of all is the one with a map. A German officer studies it while sitting on a supply crate. His compass rests on his knee. The caption: "Still moving, but where to?" That question haunted the entire Eastern campaign. Because it wasn't just geography that trapped the Germans, it was arrogance. The plan, to take Moscow in 10 weeks, was based on faulty assumptions. They thought the Soviet Union would collapse like France. But the Soviets weren't just retreating. They were preparing, drawing them in, waiting for winter. The psychological weight began to show. More graves, more empty eyes, fewer smiles. Even the propaganda photos begin to feel strained, as if trying to cover up something unraveling. The myth of German dominance was fading, replaced by something more human and terrifying: desperation. The last pages of the photo collection don't show battles. They show graves. You see a clearing in the woods, a dozen crosses, some labeled, some anonymous. A birch tree leans nearby, scarred by bullet holes. One grave has a helmet perched on top. Another has a cigarette box wedged into the dirt. These aren't dramatic war memorials. They're temporary, rushed, a way to say goodbye without any guarantee that the body would ever be found again. And they weren't. Most of the soldiers buried here never made it home. As the Soviet counteroffensive roared to life in late 1941 and early 1942, the German lines collapsed. Entire divisions vanished. One of the units featured in the photos, the 219th Infantry Division, lost over 10,000 men by the end of that winter. By March 1943, fewer than 1,200 remained. The rest were gone. The graves were left behind, swallowed by forests, buried by snowfall, erased by time. It's here that the story of this photo album truly ends. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in silence. These soldiers believed they would win, that they would return as heroes, but they became shadows instead. Bones under farmland, names on rusted dog tags, forgotten by all but the ghosts of war. And now, 80 years later, their images resurface. Raw, human, and deeply flawed. Some of these men believed they were on the right side. Others simply followed orders. Some were killers. Others were kids. The truth doesn't offer redemption, but it does offer context. And that's what these photographs do. They remind us that history isn't a headline or a textbook summary. It's real, it's messy, and it's written in the eyes of the people who were there, many of whom never got to leave.